Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your promptness. I expected nothing less, so I'm most impressed. Thank you. So now we're moving on to the next of the keynote addresses, which will be by Dr. Malcolm Davis, who's a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. The responder for this session will be Dr. Hannah Nielsen. Dr. Davis is going to talk about the technological dimension. So if you're ready, Malcolm, I'll bring you forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. Firstly, a disclaimer, I'm not an Antarctica specialist, so if I commit any egregious faux pas on Antarctica law or regulatory matters, please forgive me. My focus in my career is on space security and space policy in particular, but also more broadly, military technology and future war. So when Tony asked me to present on this topic, I thought, oh my God, Antarctica, I know nothing really about Antarctica. But then I thought, okay, apply the aspects of technology and security to this important region. And hopefully the remarks I'm giving you today will be of some use. Key message that I want to get across is this. Essentially, given its huge scale of the Australian Antarctic territory and the remoteness of the AAT from Australia, the harsh environmental and operational environment that you're talking about, we need to think about developing the means without violating the Antarctic Treaty System for developing a persistent presence of air, near space, and surface-based autonomous platforms to be able to maintain presence, to be able to maintain surveillance in a pervasive manner, to understand what is happening in the Australian Antarctic territory in terms of not only the science of climatology and Antarctic science and so forth, but also security aspects. Because the Antarctica region in particular is an increasing concern in terms of potential major power competition in coming decades. Right at the moment, we obviously do have concerns about some states such as China and potentially Russia undertaking activities that are not consistent with the Antarctic Treaty System or that would certainly challenge our sovereign interests. It's possible that those challenges over time will grow, particularly if the broader geopolitical competition across the globe between, on the one hand, Western liberal democracies led by the United States against authoritarian dictatorships led by China is to sharpen. And I think the projection is that throughout this decade and going into the next decade, that is what is going to happen. So we need to be aware that Antarctica, like space, is not this serene sanctuary that sits untouched by geopolitical rivalries. And we have to prepare for the possibility that major power competition could sharpen around and over Antarctica, and how do we respond to that challenge going forward? Antarctica, as in terms of defense policy, it's important, but quite often it's an afterthought. When you read defense white papers, quite often there's a paragraph there on Antarctica. The last Defence Strategic Update, Antarctica wasn't even really mentioned in any significance. But it's huge. It's 42% of the Australian Antarctic territory is 42% of Antarctica itself. It's located at a great distance from the Australian mainland. Includes not only a physical landmass, but a large economic exclusion zone, although we don't enforce the EEZ around Antarctica itself. We do around Heard Island, but not Antarctica itself. But we do have to think about fisheries resources and potential actions that are taken by adversaries, notably China, that could challenge our interests in this area. And I think that it's an ideal environment for exploiting advanced technologies. It's a testing ground, if you like, for us to think about how we could utilize systems in space, in near space, and in particular, the interface between space capabilities and autonomous systems to give us that that good situational awareness, that persistent situational awareness of what is happening on and around Antarctica, without going down necessarily the path of traditional military capabilities that would then violate the Antarctic Treaty System. So, in terms of China's activities, I think Clive Hamilton really nails it in terms of this quote. Over the last 10 to 15 years, the People's Republic has become heavily engaged in Antarctica, building bases, laying down airstrips, acquiring ships fitted out for the purpose. Most of its activity is within the Australian sector. Building on physical infrastructure, China maintains a permanent presence there and has been actively mapping out geographical sites. It is also establishing a base station for its Beidou satellite navigation system. The Antarctic base station will give any Chinese missile strike greater precision. And I think what he's talking about here is this. In last year, the Chinese tested what's known as a hypersonic glide vehicle. It was launched on what's known as a fractional orbital bombardment trajectory. So most ballistic missiles, when they're fired, they fire over the North Pole on a traditional ballistic trajectory. This goes over the South Pole. And essentially, it takes a little bit longer, but it allows the Chinese or the Russians to circumvent key US missile defense capabilities. They tested this twice, July 2021, August 2021. And the key thing was that rather than just a traditional test of a FOBS capability, they incorporated a hypersonic glide vehicle into the test. And by establishing Beidou ground stations in Antarctica, you have the potential for the Chinese to be able to enhance the accuracy of these sorts of capabilities. So that the hypersonic glide vehicle, when it separates from the delivery system, can adjust its trajectory en route over the South Pole to ensure that it strikes the target with greater accuracy. Now, Beidou as a system can be used for commercial purposes, obviously, just like GPS, just like Galileo and GLONASS. So the potential here is for a dual use system that can be used in civilian and commercial terms and thus not violate the Antarctic Treaty System to be used to violate the Antarctic Treaty System. And that's the sort of grey zone challenge that we need to be worried about. The potential for technologies to be deployed into Antarctica by our adversaries that, whilst not in blatant terms violating the Antarctic Treaty System, can be employed in a dual-use manner that could essentially go around it. And so something like Beidou, based in Antarctica, perhaps at somewhere like Dome A, could give the Chinese or potentially a significant advantage in developing these sorts of new types of capabilities based around hypersonic glide vehicles that certainly are likely to appear in coming years. At the same time, the potential for utilizing Antarctica to monitor space debris, a public good in the sense of managing to avoid collisions in space between space junk and satellites and so forth, can also enhance space domain awareness for military purposes. The polar and sun-synchronous orbits that go over Antarctica are vital in terms of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Australia's development of future intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance satellites will be based on polar and sun-synchronous orbits. So the potential for China, for example, to establishing ground-based space domain sensors into Antarctica gives them the ability to monitor most of the Western LEO-based intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance satellites. Once again, they can mask this as a civil and commercial activity for space situational awareness to make sure that space junk is not a problem. But at the same time, it gives them the ability to stare up, look at satellites passing overhead, gather intelligence, and coordinate attacks in space using their own counter space capabilities. So once again, this grey zone, this dual use technology, I think, is something that really we need to start thinking about and not necessarily taking everything they say at face value. Of course, the Chinese can make the same argument about us. They can say, well, you could potentially put a space domain awareness sensor down at the South Pole to monitor space junk. So two can play this game. I accept that. And when we get into thinking about the Antarctic Treaty System and how we manage potential for growing military competition in Antarctica, there needs to be an honest discussion and debate about how we manage dual role technologies and grey zone operations out of Antarctica, because this is going to be a major challenge coming toward us in coming years. I talked about Beidou. The establishment of Beidou ground stations and Russian GLONASS ground stations in Antarctica is permitted, but it does enhance their ability to use military force around the southern hemisphere. And so I think that when you look at what is happening with Chinese activities now in the Southwest Pacific, most recently with the signature of the signing of a security treaty between China and the Solomon Islands that probably in the short term will lead to the establishment of a military base in the Solomon Islands, then the potential for expanding Beidou coverage in the southern hemisphere, including from Antarctica, gives them greater military capability across the southern hemisphere, right around Australia. And the potential for naval operations to occur in the Southern Ocean would benefit from that extended Beidou coverage, including from Antarctica. China talks about the Polar Silk Road, seeks to raise its ability to participate in the protection and utilization of the South Pole in a manner that potentially could open up challenges for the Antarctic Treaty System. Once again, not to overturn it, but to circumvent it through the grey zone. It's got the fastest growing presence in Antarctica, establishing a dominant presence and a political influence. And presence on the ground gives them greater influence to shape the regulatory space going forward into the future in a way that benefits Beijing's interests. I think there is legitimate concern over China's willingness to seek a position towards eventual resource exploitation in Antarctica. Tony talked about the mining issue in terms of the difficulties in overturning that. They're undertaking mineral exploration, but they're not necessarily doing mining per se, but in a more contested environment, perhaps where we are facing a sharper risk of conflict. The Chinese might be prepared to take bolder risks in the future. So the potential risk posed by grey zone actions through new technologies, and particularly dual-use technologies, is significant. And I think that there's real parallels here with the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty doesn't ban weaponization of space. It does ban the deployment of nuclear weapons in space, but it doesn't prevent states from deploying non-nuclear weapons into space. And in terms of the use of the moon and other celestial bodies, which most clearly parallel the use of Antarctica, it's pretty vague. It's full of holes in the sense of you can have a lunar base that's not military, but it's staffed by military personnel carrying out scientific activity. But how do you define what scientific activity is if that scientific activity could potentially have military application? So when we think about the Outer Space Treaty and we think about the Antarctic Treaty System, they suffer from the same problems. They're a bit vague. They were written back in a different era when we didn't have, firstly, an aggressive China pursuing its global ambitions, but secondly, as was mentioned earlier, potential for non-state actors to come into the scene, commercial companies, perhaps commercial companies representing state actors operating on their behalf. And suddenly you find when you look deeper into these treaties, you see more and more holes that need to be filled. Because if we just blithely assume the Antarctic Treaty System is gold as is written, then potentially we are wandering into a minefield of potential traps going forward that our adversaries will exploit. So I think what potentially is relevant here is a boiling frog analogy, where you see China reshape the security environment going forward over an extended period of time. They're not going to move aggressively quickly because they understand that that would cause an immediate reaction. Instead, they'll seek to exploit political control in key organizations and regulatory bodies to debate the future of the Antarctic Treaty System, gradually challenge our security interests in the Antarctic Treaty, Australian Antarctic Treaty region, and more broadly, reshape the ATS over time to suit Beijing's interests. This is the approach they're using right across the board in many areas of international regulation. So Antarctica should be no different. In 2019, China sought to gain control of Dome AUKUS, or Dome A as it's often called, which is the highest location on the Antarctic ice sheet. And it was an ideal location for satellite surveillance. Luckily, their efforts failed in this instance, but it's not likely to be the last time they try to change the character and conduct of the ATS to suit their needs. Certainly, I think they're conscious of the resource wealth in Antarctica and the geostrategic importance of its location, and the growth of new technologies, particularly in terms of space capabilities, but also potentially autonomous systems, open up new potential avenues for challenge. So this is where I want to go now with the rest of my presentation, is how do we use these new capabilities to counter that threat, and what sorts of threats are we likely to face? Because, as I said earlier, two can play the same game. Chinese can develop the space capabilities and the autonomous systems to really challenge us. So let me turn now to future technology and Antarctic security. Quite correctly, like the Outer Space Treaty, the Antarctic Treaty System seeks to ensure that Antarctica shall continue to be forever used for peaceful purposes and shall not become a scene or object of international discord. So it prohibits military activity per se in terms of, military maneuvers, military exercises, deployment of military forces. But it allows the deployment of military personnel at bases to undertake scientific research. And as I said earlier, how do you define what constitutes scientific research? Scientific research could include enhancing Beidou technologies to give better global navigation satellite capabilities. That can be applied for commercial and civil purposes. That's a public good. But it could also make Chinese missile systems far more effective and accurate. At all areas of Antarctica, including all installations shall be open at all times to inspection. Well, how do we do that if we're not unsure of exactly what is happening in those bases, and if the Chinese don't necessarily allow us access at all times? That's what the treaty says, but there's ways around that. And I go back to the Outer Space Treaty. As we go back to the moon in this decade and beyond, where we will be establishing a permanent presence on the lunar surface, there will be the risk that bases established, staffed by military personnel, could be used for military activities without necessarily declaring it. And I think that that's the sort of thing we could see in Antarctica. So how do we secure interest in this more contested future domain, where the grey zone really is the key way for states to utilize these regions, Antarctica and the moon, for military purposes without necessarily violating the treaty? In terms of securing economic exclusion zones, we obviously focus very much on Heard Island and Macquarie Island. As I said, we don't enforce the economic exclusion zone around the Australian Antarctic Territory itself. So we have to think about how we operate in those regions. What are some of the possibilities? I think that probably maritime domain awareness comes to the fore in terms of understanding what is happening around those regions. Right at the moment, our approach to maritime domain awareness around Antarctica, particularly around areas like Heard Island, is to dispatch a maritime patrol aircraft, a P8 or a P3, or dispatch a naval vessel. Well, let's think about how we invest in air and maritime patrol assets that can operate at long range with long endurance. And the illustrations up there of these advanced stratospheric UAS, or unmanned autonomous systems, I think is one example where we can invest in new capabilities that can give us persistent surveillance. These are known as pseudo-satellites, by the way, because they operate at very high altitude. They have solar panels built into the wings that allow them to remain on station for weeks at end. So the greater potential for investing in these sorts of technologies, sort of stratospheric UAS that can be deployed and remain over Antarctica for weeks on end to give surveillance around key focal areas, I think is one way that we can move forward. We can complement that with autonomous surface vessels without having to deploy a crew. We can have vessels down there that can patrol key regions, and obviously greater use of space surveillance. Defence has a key project going forward called DEF 799 Phase 2, which is about space-based intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Part of that obviously should be focusing very much on how we ensure surveillance of the Australian Antarctic territory. So the key point here is investment into high altitude, long endurance UAVs, pseudo satellites in near space, advanced satellite networks in space to protect and ensure protracted air surveillance of key maritime regions. If we understand what's happening in the region, then we have some way of responding to it, as opposed to having intermittent surveillance through a limited number of crewed platforms. I talked about unmanned surface vessels. This is the OSIUS Systems Blue Bottle. It's a small unmanned surface vessel that could be deployed from Nuena in large numbers. It's fully networked, so you could have a network of these unmanned surface vessels patrolling around the Southern Ocean, monitoring activities, conducting surveillance in concert with the pseudo-satellites that I talked about earlier, as well as space-based surveillance. So the key point here is the network of capabilities, the ability to combine surface-based systems, airspace systems, and space-based systems working together. And these are being tested by the Royal Australian Navy right now. So the potential for utilising these advanced technologies needs to start to filter into the discussion. We need to move beyond traditional platforms and traditional thinking to recognise that in the next 2 decades, if we don't deploy these systems, our adversaries will. Unmanned underwater vehicles are already being considered. This is the Anduril extra large unmanned autonomous vehicle for undersea operations. Gives us the potential for, once again, monitoring maritime activities from an undersea perspective, including submarine operations. And, you know, submarines do operate close to Antarctica. So it extends that envelope even further from where we're already going in terms of the air and the surface. And space. The ability to exploit advanced ISR capabilities in low Earth orbit and medium Earth orbit that are polar and sun synchronous. The ability to complement the DEF 799 Phase 2 satellites that will be acquired as early as 2026 with a networked mega constellation of commercial small satellite technologies that can essentially create a high-low mix between the larger satellites being developed for DEF 799 Phase 2 and a networked swarm of smaller satellites that give you that pervasive surveillance from low Earth orbit, all tied in with advanced satellite communications that is going to be provided by JP9102. So you have this space segment that is established that gives you surveillance and communications in a network digital form that is then connected into a surveillance assets in near space, pseudo satellites, space, and also on the surface in terms of ocean maritime surveillance. Commercial space surveillance, I think, is also a path forward for Australia to consider. There's already discussion in the recent Tokyo Quad Summit to develop such a capability for maritime surveillance, primarily to deal with the threat of black ships, which are fishing vessels that turn off their AIS and then go and do illegal fishing. You know, the use of electro-optical and ELINT and SIGINT detection is there. Hawkeye 360 is an American company that do commercial ELINT and SIGINT. We can tie into their satellites to give us coverage of fishing activities, even with dark ships, and then Q observation from electro-optical satellites and UAVs. So it's about building a system of systems. It's about building a network that then gives us much greater situational awareness of what's happening around the Australian Antarctic territory in terms of other states' activities. And I think this is a critical step going forward, rather than just assuming that the current approach of relying on a few crewed vessels, wherever they're on the surface with NUINA or the occasional flight by a P8, is sufficient. We need to go much further and be much more ambitious in terms of how we do this. But all of this can be done in a way that is consistent with the Antarctic Treaty System, because this is all applying about surveillance. It's not necessarily about applying military force per se. And given that we are, as a country, moving now to become a space power in a fairly decisive manner, let's take advantage of that. We're moving very quickly towards sovereign design of satellites, launching those satellites on Australian launch vehicles from Australian launch sites. We're probably within a year or two of launching our first satellite on an Australian launch vehicle from an Australian launch site. That's a huge step forward from where we were 10 years ago, where nothing was happening in this country in terms of space, because we were relying extensively on the Americans to provide the space segment for us. We're now becoming a provider of space capabilities. So our ability to develop those space capabilities quickly through emphasis in small satellites and responsive space launch gives us the ability to augment coverage over focal areas, including for maritime domain awareness. If we understand that there's a challenge occurring in the Southern Ocean, we can respond through a combination of space, near space, and surface-based assets to give us that maritime domain awareness capability as part of a whole of government approach, and also within the Five Eyes. As I said, space capabilities, autonomous systems, these can all be applied within the constraints of the ATS. No one here is advocating that we militarize Antarctica, okay? Both areas of capability contribute towards delivery of common public goods, because this information can be shared not only within the Australian Defence Force and the whole of government approach within Australia, but it can be shared with our partners in the Five Eyes and beyond to manage the effective use of Antarctica as a region consistent with the manner within the constraints of the ATS. And I think AUKUS, the AUKUS agreement signed last year, does lend itself to the development of these capabilities. So let's exploit that. Let's develop the sorts of resilient space and autonomous systems that can then be applied to this critical focal area of national security interests. Certainly, it's consistent also with defence strategy. The Defence Strategic Update emphasises the strategy of shape, deter, respond. We need to emphasise an awareness of the potential activities of competitors to highlight the grey zone risks rather than not responding. That demands increased investment in persistent surveillance. We need to have that awareness through surveillance to contribute to more effective deterrence, because if an adversary understands that there will be attribution, that there is no anonymity, they can't necessarily get away with grey zone activities like they could in the past. So that includes everything from illegal fishing through to something more sinister that could be occurring on the Australian Antarctic territory itself. But this gives us an ability to respond in a manner that doesn't challenge the ATS, but allows us to make better use of diplomatic and political and economic pressure if we see a challenge emerging. So, as important as ships like NUINA are, and it's a hugely important vessel, I see it as just the beginning of the process, not the end point. I see it as really a starting point from which we could build a complete system of capabilities to give us that broad area persistent surveillance from space, from near space, and from the surface. And where does this take us? Where do we go in the future with this? What's the potential possibilities here? The commercial space sector, I think, is moving down the path of satellite mega constellations. These will provide persistent Earth observation and satellite communications. Already you have SpaceX developing Starlink, which gives that broadband in the sky. You had Starlink terminals provided to Ukrainian forces to give them access to the internet at the outset of the Ukraine conflict. You know, this is the future. There's potential for thousands of small satellites to be able to be deployed to give persistent communications or surveillance capability. That lends itself to supporting the rapid growth of autonomous systems, the better use of autonomous capabilities of increasing sophistication, including through the use of artificial intelligence within those autonomous systems, so that we have a prolonged, persistent presence over key focal areas with humans on or off the loop where necessary. We have that ability to understand what is happening over Antarctica on a 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year capability in all weathers, rather than intermittent coverage or dependent on others to provide coverage for us. And so really the question is, how can Australia utilise next generation technologies to protect security interests, even in a highly challenging operational environment, including in Antarctica? That should be a key question going forward. How can we utilise technology better? How can we be more innovative and bolder in our thinking, rather than just saying, well, maybe we need another Antarctic survey vessel? Yes, fine. But what can that survey vessel do in combination with a range of new technologies that are on the horizon or appearing now? And must we start thinking about how to defend territory if the ATS system does break down? It could break down. And then we have to start thinking, well, at what point do we decide we are going to defend that territory? It's Australian territory. So, you know, we have to judge what happens if our sovereignty is challenged, because there's no guarantees that the Antarctic Treaty System will stay forever, just as there's no guarantees the Outer Space Treaty will not be violated by our adversaries in coming years. I'll finish there and I'm happy to do questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. That was excellent. Very thorough and very thought-provoking too, so well done. Now, I'm going to invite Dr. Hannah Nielsen to give the first response, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Malcolm. Thanks, AJ. A lot to think about here from the talk. If we come back to the beginning there, we've ascertained that Antarctica is remote, but it is impacted by geopolitics elsewhere in the world. And also technology is meaning that our understanding of that remoteness is changing as well. It's getting more and more accessible over time. And as that knowledge of that space does change and our access changes, the implications of how we interact with or how we perceive the way that others interact with that place also becomes really important, particularly as further infrastructure might be extending those capabilities. And that could have positive implications, things like having a better scientific understanding of this region, or perhaps opportunities for better understanding what's going on with vessels in regards to IUU fishing and the like, or as the example given with space debris, using Antarctica to look up and see what's happening there, framing that as a public good. But again, we saw that also can have a benefit in terms of that situational awareness, what's happening with those satellites in space. And the point made also that what Australia might say about what other nations are doing could also be said about what Australia is doing. We've seen some concerns raised about the presence, for instance, of China in the Antarctic, that those are including things like political influence as well as physical presence in the far south, which I think comes to a question of values as well. What do we value in Antarctica? What sort of a future do we want to see for that place, which is something we might revisit in the panel discussion here too. We've seen mention as well of how could we be using technology in different ways, for instance, to counter threats. I guess it comes to this question too of how is that technology being used. The question of what defines scientific research is one in the Antarctic context, where we can also be drawing on bodies like the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research too, with that best available science for making decisions. And we have the note as well that this networking aspect is really important when we're looking at Antarctica and wanting to understand what's happening over a larger space. This network, these different platforms we might be using, unmanned surface vehicles, pseudo satellites that near Earth orbit as well, but working together to give that bigger picture. I wonder if we might also pick up on the ways that some of this remote technology might be used, for instance, with inspections. I know it's been mentioned with recent inspections from the USA with remotely piloted aircraft systems. So could there be further implications there? Would Antarctic Treaty consultative parties agree to that use as well? We've got a focus on awareness being very important with those activities that are currently underway in the Antarctic. And I guess that raises the questions too of what sort of a future are we wanting to model? What does that global future look like? How could Australia be a leader in that regard? Which we might also pick up on some of those perceptions of this technology as well. And that cultural side of things also might play a role. That brings us back to the sort of central principles of the Antarctic Treaty. And looking forward, it's important to keep those in mind, ensuring that Antarctica shall continue to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes and not become that scene of international discord. So we could be asking here what role surveillance might play, how might that be perceived both within Australia and outside, and to what extent has that traditional model of using science diplomacy, to what regard is that still useful, and might this technology play into that, and to what extent is this taking that conversation further as well? Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Hannah. So now we'll open up the floor for questions. To pick up on any of the points that Malcolm's raised or Hannah has raised, please.
Paul Ferguson, RUSI. Towards the end of your talk, you were talking about the protection of defence assets or security assets, etc. But I'd like to take a step before that, which is the protection of our surveillance assets, because I'm not too sure what is in place where you can protect the surveillance assets. And I think we see already the interference with surveillance assets which we currently have. The use of lasers against the, to try and blind pilots, the dropping of magnesium chaff for surveillance aircraft and so on. So it seems to me that our reaction to those interferences is relatively mild and ineffective. So what do you think we need to put in place to protect those surveillance assets? Because I'm quite certain we will see them being interfered with.
It's a great question, and so obviously you're referring to the incident over the Timor Sea with the Chinese destroyer that lased one of our P3s. Look, I think that with autonomous systems, you accept the fact that these are losable systems. They can be incredibly expensive, and I'm thinking of the MQ-4C Triton here. You don't want to lose one of those. And I think going down the path of spending billions on a single platform is probably the wrong way to go. So we need to develop a suite of autonomous systems for surveillance that are losable and that's not so expensive. And if you do see interference from an adversary, the way you're talking about with perhaps using lasers or some sort of electronic warfare system, well, then that's a hostile act. And we then can respond to that by deploying additional systems. But we recognize there's a risk that if we're going to do this, you do potentially lose some systems. But if they're developed in a way that's affordable and attritable, that's not quite the same as losing a Triton. And I think that that's the sort of a philosophy we have to take. Low cost and many affordable systems. That if we lose a few, okay, we've lost a few, but we understand where we stand with an adversary, and maybe we can then take further actions. If we go down the path of spending billions on more Tritons, then we can't afford to lose them. So therefore, we have a real problem then. How do you protect those critical platforms? And I think that I'm not sure how we do that short of militarizing the Antarctic region, which we don't want to do because then that's in violation of the Antarctic Treaty System. So the path that we need to go down, in my opinion, is small, cheap, and many, rather than the large, expensive, and few.
Thanks, Dr. Davis, for your presentation. Just a question sort of following on from that. You've identified those potential capabilities that might counter that threat, but can you provide a comment where you see there's capability gaps where we haven't got investment in those capabilities that are obviously dire and need to invest in the next 10 years to sort of counter that? Because obviously not a key driver for technology procurement or capability development for the Australian Antarctic Division, or Antarctic territories. Interested in where you think the capability gaps are and where we need to invest now in the next decade or so.
Yeah, a great question once again. I think that we need to shift our mindsets to a degree. Defence has a problem in terms of slow acquisition. And it's slow acquisition because they invest in exquisite boutique platforms that cost a lot because they're so complex, and so we can only afford to get a small number. What we need to do is invest in fast acquisition. That we can invest in a range of capabilities that can be developed quickly, that we can acquire in greater numbers, and if we lose some, we lose some. But we can acquire them much more rapidly, and we can go on acquiring them much more rapidly. So it's not just about a one-off acquisition process of, well, let's get 20 UAVs. We're keeping on acquiring these UAV systems, so we continually build up capabilities. Same goes with space. JP9102, our advanced satellite communications capability, is going to be based around 4 or 5 large satellites of GEO. That will be expensive, it will be complex, but we need to complement those 4 or 5 large satellites with a large number of small satellites in LEO and MEO to augment that capability and make space more resilient. Otherwise, if we just invest in a traditional constellation, they're vulnerable to adversary counterspace systems. So it's about changing mindsets. It's about getting defence to think about, as I was saying to the last question, the small, the cheap, and the many, and how quickly can we accelerate capability acquisition, not just for high intensity warfighting, but for these sorts of quasi defence roles, sort of a maritime domain awareness around Antarctica as well. So I would, in answer to your question, I would say let's start thinking about new ways of doing capability acquisition of autonomous systems, of space capabilities, of those sorts of systems, so that we can build up very rapidly rather than traditional defence capability acquisition process that lasts 2 decades or so forth.
Yeah. You talked a lot about Australia and what Australia can do, what Australia should do, and what not. The problems in Antarctica strike me as affecting a number of other countries who have similar interests to us. Is there any move afoot, or would you like to comment even on the desirability of there being such moves towards some sort of supranational networking and sharing of information and sharing of public shaming and so forth, which would ease the burden on individual countries that are rather cash-strapped?
Yeah, it makes eminent sense to go down that path of building some sort of consortium of states working together to ensure attribution of irresponsible activities in the grey zone, some sort of denial of anonymity to adversaries. And so maybe there needs to be some sort of discussion at a political and diplomatic level about how we, with our allies in Antarctica, can work together in the same way that we do, for example, in space with the Combined Space Operations Initiative, CSPO, have something equivalent for Antarctica, whereby we can share information, we can collectively gather information using these sorts of technologies and have a common operating picture of what's happening around Antarctica. And it makes it much more difficult for an adversary like China to be able to undertake grey zone operations or to challenge our interests. And I think that's a very sensible suggestion. So maybe that's something that needs to go forward in future discussions in regards to the Antarctic Treaty System. To my knowledge, no. As I said at the beginning, I'm not an Antarctic expert, so there could be something that I'm not aware of. But if there isn't, it should be happening. That's my point.
Thank you. A fundamental premise of Dr. Davis's presentation is that we mustn't look at the Antarctic Treaty System through rose-coloured spectacles and idealise it, and think that the ideals of the treaty are always going to continue, and that we must prepare for that and be ready to respond if that changes. But that doesn't mean, I don't think, that we need to abandon the fundamental philosophy that has sustained the treaty up till now. We need to remember that, after all, it has shown itself to be quite extraordinarily strong. You even go back to the Falklands War, when Argentina and the UK were engaged in a hot war, but under the civilising umbrella of the Antarctic Treaty System, they were actually able to engage in civilised discussions and activity, strangely enough, here in Hobart. And then an even stronger example, the treaty survived the Cold War, which was a very significant and powerful conflict, which nearly spilled over into a hot war. So I was just wondering, are we in the danger of abandoning something that still has great potential power? For example, there are still scholarly exchanges between Antarctic scientists, Chinese and Australian, and I'm particularly thinking of China, and visits under the treaty system are still being made openly and in a good spirit by of the different bases and stations in Antarctica. So are we running the danger of abandoning the advantages of quarantining the Antarctic sphere from other areas of defence and foreign affairs, which is what we do to some extent in Australia now, and we would hope to persuade other countries to continue to do?
Look, I don't think we're in any danger of abandoning the ATS. We want to strengthen it and preserve it. And that means we have to close off any loopholes or vulnerabilities where an adversary could exploit the weaknesses to gain advantage and erode the ATS in the process. So the points I'm making is, let's actually have a stronger ATS. Let's actually have a stronger ability to ensure that there are no vulnerabilities. And we can still preserve the scientific community engagement between China and Australia and Russia and the United States and so forth in Antarctica. There's nothing wrong with that. And if you look at the space domain, that's the same thing as happening there, although I have to say the Russia-US engagement in space has taken a battering since Ukraine. So, you know, I think what I'm saying is, no, we're not going to chuck aside the ATS. We're trying to strengthen it. We're trying to make sure that there's less opportunity for the ATS to be eroded by the activities of the Chinese government. And remember, Chinese scientists in Antarctica don't make the policy decisions. It is the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing that makes the policy decisions. It is the Russian government in the Kremlin. So I would differentiate between the scientific community, and you do see really good cooperation between, for example, the Russians and the Americans in science over many years, even throughout the Cold War, versus their governments. A classic example on that, November last year, the Russians did an anti-satellite weapons test, which created a huge cloud of space debris. Roscosmos was never informed that this test was going to go ahead. And so suddenly cosmonauts on the International Space Station are told potentially the International Space Station is at risk. You have to maneuver the space station to avoid the debris cloud created by the ASAT test. So there's a differentiation between, on the one hand, the scientific community, the civil scientific community, and on the other hand, the government. And I think we need to be able to strengthen the ATS so that it's more difficult for governments to erode it. And that's where you need greater awareness of what's happening in the region. Does that answer your question? Excellent.
Good morning, sir. Corporal Wilson, 1240 RTR. Real quick one about the on a security level with defence. Do you actually think that with everything that is happening in the ADF at the moment and all of the issues that are arising throughout on the planet at the moment, do you think that Antarctica is something that we really should be starting to pay a lot more attention to in the security realm, or do you think that maybe it's overhyped, or do you think maybe it's actually a bit of a sleeping beast and that we really need to be paying more attention down there more than we are at the moment?
Look, I think we need to pay more attention. It's not obviously at the top of the list. The top of the list is Ukraine with Russia, Taiwan with China. There's not pull any punches about that. But Ukraine is important. Sorry, Antarctica is important, and we can start thinking about how we address it in coming years. And remember that the sort of technologies that I'm talking about don't necessarily have to wear RWF roundels. It could be commercial technologies that exploit high altitude pseudo-satellite systems or commercial space capabilities that can give Antarctic security a boost. So I'm emphasizing technologies here that can be applied through the commercial and civil space rather than necessarily having to be an ADF mission. Similar sort of technologies will be acquired for the ADF for other purposes, but we can develop these technologies as we go and start to apply them rather than relying on traditional approaches to Antarctic security. And I fear that in coming years, Antarctica will elevate in importance in terms of defence and security, particularly as major power competition around the globe sharpens and intensifies.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your time so far. Jacob Fisher, I'm Australian Regular Army. I work in training systems, which is a new job to me, but it's very heavily focused on, the skill sets that people have. So not necessarily just linked to Antarctica, but more broadly in emerging technology and their application. We find that, building sovereign capability is very important. But I think at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity out there for the commercial organizations to get a cut of the white paper pie, if you will. And that's creating some competition in the personnel realm and the human resource we need to realize these new technologies. Do you think the whole of government is doing enough to develop interest to make sure that we're getting enough of that resource? Because I think it's the most important one and the hardest one to generate more of, because we are population to size and we have certain restrictions. Do you think the government is doing enough to ensure that we're getting the right people in the right fields interested in doing it for the government side of it rather than the commercial side of it?
Look, I think it's a challenge, as you quite correctly point out. For example, in defence, the future nuclear submarine program has sucked a lot of people out of their jobs and into the submarine study. So there is a risk that the traditional legacy platforms kind of overwhelm everything else, and there's not enough people thinking through next generation capabilities or future modernization. That's a personnel issue that we do have to address. It could be addressed through bringing more people directly into defence and into the ADF, but it could also be addressed by better consultation and integration between defence and the commercial sector. And this is what I'm seeing in the space sector all the time. You have a vibrant, growing commercial space sector in this country, which has gone from essentially 0 10 years ago to, one of the most impressive internationally now. And government is starting to pay attention, and we're starting to talk to the commercial space sector, which is as it should be. So the same thing could happen in other areas such as autonomous systems. How can we set up companies to develop autonomous systems? Because these autonomous systems that we're talking about are not just going to be for defense purposes. They could be for civil and commercial applications as well. Think of what you could do with UAVs over major Australian cities doing traffic monitoring and so forth. So I think that there's all sorts of opportunities to develop the personnel resource beyond traditional approaches of someone joining defense and putting on a uniform or becoming a public servant. I think that's one way to approach it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes, Alistair Graham, inveterate NGO, Antarctic Treaty System, tragic. One of my concerns listening to your presentation is that it seems clear to me that you want to play in the grey zone just like the Chinese do, and that I'm worried that you stand the potential to undermine the Antarctic Treaty System rather than bolstering it if you propose to do things other than as part of an inspection under the inspection regime. Do you have plans to do an analysis to work out precisely where that line is? Because listening to you just now, it strikes me that you're way over the line in terms of playing in the grey zone when we actually want to take the moral high ground to push back against people who want to play in the grey zone.
That's a good question, and I think you're making a valid point there. You know, how do we avoid becoming the thing we're trying to challenge? I think we know that they're going to do it, so we have to respond. The question is, how do we respond in a manner that's consistent with the ATS? I would argue that commercial and civil application of these technologies is consistent with the ATS. We're not militarizing Antarctica. Okay, we are utilizing technologies to do maritime domain awareness, which is, I think, a soft mission compared to deploying Navy and Air Force. Now, yes, of course, the Chinese will claim, well, you're impinging on the ATS, but if they're doing the same thing, how do we respond? We can't just not respond. Yes, we could say, oh, well, we're only going to respond through traditional approaches of inspections. But if at the same time they're kind of circumventing traditional ATS standards, we're going in with one hand tied behind our back. So this is a challenge that I agree is in front of us, is how do we manage the ATS and strengthen the ATS without violating the ATS? They don't care, I don't think. We do. So we've got, as you say, that we've got to try and find the high moral ground, but at the same time respond effectively to their actions. Because if we don't, then the ATS will fall. The ATS will be undermined. So it's an ethical dilemma, which I don't have an easy answer to, I'm afraid. And I wish I did, because it's a really good question.
Hi, thanks very much, and thanks very much to the organisers as well. This is a really stimulating discussion. I'm really enjoying it. So I'm Dirk Welsford. I'm the chair of the Scientific Committee of CAMLR. I also work for the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. It's later than people think, perhaps. So that blue yacht with solar panels on it, the Navy's
Blue Bottle,
thank you. So Norwegian commercial fishing vessels are already deploying them themselves in the South Atlantic to find krill, because they recognise that driving a boat around trying to find krill is very inefficient. So they're chucking those over the side and they sail around and find krill swarms for them. That's already happening. The redefinition of what science is already happening in CAMLR as well. So that's been going on for the last 10 years off the back of discussions around what a marine protected area is and what a best available science definition of the justified marine protected area is. So, we're already a long way down the track to, seeing things like those technologies being deployed by other countries, and also redefining what science is, that core part of the treaty. So just wanted to note that.
Yeah, thank you for that. No, it's good to see that we are making progress, but I do think we need to push forward and make faster progress. Anyone else?
Any more?
Lady here.
Yeah, Vicky Heinrich. I'm a PhD student looking at weather decision making in Antarctica or in Australia. So looking at the public good side of it, some of these automated vehicles, can we put weather sensors on them? Because one barrier to improving weather forecasts in the polar regions is those large data gaps over the Southern Ocean, Atlantic Oceans. So is there possibilities that we can use that dual purpose?
Absolutely. If there's gaps, then let's explore how technology can help us solve those gaps, whether it's a space-based capability using small satellites in LEO, or whether it's some sort of pseudo-satellite in near space, or some sort of remote ground station on Antarctica itself, or even a blue bottle with a weather monitoring platform. All of these options are open to us. And I think my main point of my entire presentation is think outside the box, do something new. Be bold, be innovative, and let's actually try to integrate these sorts of new technologies as fast as possible
to give us a better understanding of what is happening in Antarctica, whether it's for defense and security or whether it's for science. These technologies can help us.